Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining the webinar this evening. We're very excited to have you. Joined by, well, there's three of us here. Mr. James Ingold. James was president of SaskCulture from 2012 to 2014, and also with me, who's our current past president and to 2018, and the three of us, other members Culture Board, as well as consultation from staff, form the Constitutional Committee just to review and sort of see what needed being updated. Just want to start off by tonight to acknowledge that we're broadcasting here from Treaty 4 territory in Regina, Saskatchewan, home to the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota First Nations, and the homeland of the Métis peoples. And just want to acknowledge some of the SaskCulture staff, staff outreach, Damon Badger-Height, and communications consultant, Shelley Fayant, and CEO Rose Gilks are off screen, but they are online with us in the webinar. So you should have received a copy of the draft constitutional changes in previous correspondence. However, if you don't have a copy handy, you can download it from the webinar. Just let us know in the chat field if you require any technical support, and SaskCulture staff are on hand to assist you. We're going to be having opportunities for questions throughout the evening, and you can do so either privately or publicly just using the tools on the webinar as well. And if you wish to ask questions later on, you can always contact SaskCulture CEO Rose Gilks at rgilks, that's RGILKS at saskculture.ca. In-person constitutional member consultations will also take place at the time and locations identified on your screen. These proposed changes will go to the membership at AGM on June 14th, 2019 in Regina.
So thanks, James. The proposed changes have come out as the organization reflects on its last 20 years and looks forward to the next 20 years. Some of you might recall, we talked about this at our last AGM on how we're taking this opportunity to, pave the way for our future for the next number of years. Some of the changes are simply adjustments to the language to be more current. Others are substantial and are in response to the changes that are happening in society, in our province, and our country today moving forward.
And as we go through it in this webinar, we're not going to be going through it in the order that you'll find it in the constitutional document, but rather we're going to kind of take it by starting with the simpler, more straightforward changes, like the ones that Joanne mentioned, kind of housekeeping things, and then leave the principles and values for the end, because that's where we're making some more of the substantive changes, and that'll allow a little bit more space for discussion around that.
Okay, thanks, James. I'm not going to mess up anybody's name here tonight. So participants can follow along on their draft copy of the Constitution beginning on page 1. SaskCulture's vision statement is an aspirational description of what the organization would like to work towards in the long-term future. It's intended to serve as a clear guide for choosing current and future courses of action. So the proposed change, which is in red underlined on the slide, recognizes that everyone might not be a citizen of Saskatchewan and that some communities simply do not like the word citizen. So SaskCulture strives to build a culturally vibrant future in which all people in Saskatchewan, individually and collectively, celebrate, value, and support participation in and access to cultural experience. Is our proposed change. Moving to the mission statement, SaskCulture's mission statement defines who we are as an organization, why it exists, and its reason for being. The new statement, once again shown in red, speaks more clearly and concisely to SaskCulture's role. Quite simply, SaskCulture unites the cultural community and works to advance the vibrancy of the province. So turning to page 3 of the draft Constitution and Bylaws document, At this point, as James mentioned, we're going to go out of order a little bit. We're going to bypass the principles and values section and come back to it once we've covered off the less substantive portions of the proposed change. There are primarily two aspects of the COI term. That's communities of interest. It's been used in describing the 6 categories for board positions, as well as to describe the organization's SaskCulture funds for leadership in a particular area. We're recommending that the communities of interest term not be used in the Constitution. Currently, it only appears in 2 places, and it can be easily revised as follows. And you can see it in the document there. Page 3 of the document shown in the slide, and again on page 7, which is explained in the following slide. So for page 7, this is the second instance with the term community of interest is removed from the Constitution. The term community of interest is redundant in terms of the Constitution because number 25 under the Board of Directors defines a qualified board. Referencing from page 6 of the draft document, here's point 25. In relation to the communities of interest, the board positions and representation are unchanged, aside from number 25, cultural industries, should be updated to creative industries to better reflect current terminology. Moving back to page 3 of the draft Constitution and bylaws document. When reviewing the current Constitution, the board could not find any good reason to keep the words "for the time being," so remove them. The Constitution clearly spells out our election process, which defines when the board members are in office. The positions of chair and past chair were then added to provide clarity that these 2 positions are part of the board's 10 directors. Now, going back to forward to page 6 of the draft document, we're also proposing that the titles of the officers be changed from president, vice president, and past president to chair, vice chair, and past chair. The change reflects the current terminology and practice of SaskCulture's Tri-Global and other partners. Again, updating for current terminology for boards. These changes occur throughout the document, and word changes from this point onward. We're not going to review each instance as they occur. You can note each change as they are marked throughout the document. And now we're just going to be able to take some questions if anybody has any on the stream. And not seeing any questions. And again, feel free to use the boxes at any time to enter your questions, but we will carry on and we'll send it to James.
Sorry, it was a little bit remiss. So there's 2 Jameses on this. I'm James Rose, and then there's James Engel, current president, and we're past president.
See, I told you I can't be wrong if I just say James.
Oh, that's true. Okay,
It's
my
James.
apologies.
Sorry, James.
You'll be up next. My apologies, James. So we've now covered all the housekeeping items within the Constitution and bylaws and are ready to tackle what we see as the quote, significant and substantive changes. The principles and values identify what the organization stands for. They are the foundational and key to its success. Every aspect of the organization outputs are based upon the principles and values. Volunteers and staff, as well as the membership, have a responsibility to understand these values and principles and to demonstrate them in their day-to-day actions and interactions on behalf of the organizations. Values. Values are fundamental beliefs. The strengths of the organization are built on these core values. These are the essence of the organizations. Principles. Principles are guides to behaviors. They guide how an organization lives the values. In everything the organization does, the principles are applied within balance.
So, as James mentioned, these are very foundational and impactful points within the Constitution. So the question is, why are we making any changes now? And the first answer would be, we're at this 20-year mark, and we don't really want to rest on our laurels. We recognize that a lot has changed in 20 years, and we want to make sure that the organization is vibrant and thriving and supporting a cultural community with its needs for the next 20. with regards to that, SaskCulture is trying to be responsive to the changing demographics to the province and to a lot of the statistical data that we've seen with relation to diversity and inclusion strategy. On top of that, there was the release of the Truth and Reconciliation report, its 10 guiding principles, and the 94 calls to action that are included with that. They have, as we'll come back to in a moment, a big challenge for everyone who lives in Canada. On top of that, we've got an ongoing commitment to the advancement of SaskCulture's diversity and inclusion strategy, which we have already begun. And then lastly, or lastly, at least in the order that I'm saying it, not in order of import, SaskCulture's members have actually asked for this, and we'll come back to the data around that. They've indicated that First Nation and Métis populations and the response to the TRC are some of the top issues that cultural organizations have to respond to today. So continuing on here, first I'm going to speak to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. In 2015, which actually sounds like it was a long time ago now, but it produced its final report. This was a culmination of 6 years of testimony from over nearly 7,000 witnesses of residential schools in Canada. According to the final report, the 100 years of Canada's Aboriginal policy, in which, and this is quoting, the establishment and operation of residential schools were a central element, and they described this as cultural genocide. The release of that report was a really historic moment in Canada when we're trying to finally come forward with the truth of what occurred in Canada and make this really present for everyone to see. When the report first came out, SaskCulture's board and staff sat down together to talk about this, really understand the impact of the report and what it is actually calling for from us as an organization. We reflected on the actions that we've already been taking in the past number of years and how do those things connect and what it might mean for our future actions. It became really evident to those around the table at the time that the report and the subsequent calls to action speak fairly directly to many areas of SaskCulture's work. Especially so in this case, of the 94 recommendations that were outlined by the Commission, a huge number of them land squarely on matters pertaining specifically to culture. So as we work towards the development and implementation of our own diversity and inclusion strategies, SaskCulture acknowledges that this report challenges all cultural groups and Saskatchewan residents to not only be aware of these calls to action, but consider how we can actually be part of that reconciliation process. The Commission's recommendations, they impact many areas of Canadian policy, and it's our jobs as leaders in the cultural community to ensure that the changes are made where needed in our organizations, and that this reconciliation process is not ignored. The calls in action have been made to governments at all levels to work with Indigenous peoples to enact the changes. However, as the Commission noted, this is not an Aboriginal problem, it's a Canadian problem. So in order to reconciliation to occur, we must recognize our part in that. We do, of course, acknowledge that there's a lot more to do as we work towards reconciliation in Saskatchewan, but SaskCulture is at the same time pleased that some of our efforts in the last several years have really been validated by the report. We've made some modest improvements already, or modest movement already on what some of the calls to action were identified. And much of that work was identified in our diversity and inclusion strategy. I think we recognize them as baby steps, but incremental success towards those ends. Internally, SaskCulture has made gains in securing Indigenous peoples in leadership positions at all levels of our organization, on our board, within our staff, and as program volunteer assessors. For instance, of those volunteer assessor members, nearly half are Indigenous peoples. Our project funding has also closed the gap from where it used to be, and roughly 41% of all project funding in SaskCulture's program funding is allocated to the cultural priorities identified by Indigenous peoples in communities across the province. Externally then, we've also begun to impress the importance of of diversity and inclusion to all groups that we support, and have begun the process of assisting cultural organizations with their own planning on that front. We have also seen a steady uptake from First Nations bands, tribal councils, and Indigenous cultural agencies who are accessing the funds to address the action items of TRC within their own communities. We've seen an uptake of the cross-cultural programming designed to build cultural awareness for everyone. There's, of course, once again, still lots more to do to support the reconciliation process. So just to kind of summarize that all, the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Report is a pivotal moment in going forward as Canadians. And how we handle that reconciliation portion of that report and the recommendations that come with it will be really important if we are to be able to be a truly diverse and inclusive place. So this is our proposed changes, are how we're trying to address that. So the effort to begin a lot of those changes, and I'm just going to continue to flip forward here. The effort to begin this process of the constitutional review, rather, with a focus on TRC began in late 2017. Now, convincingly and also reassuringly, in the fall of 2018, SaskCulture had we surveyed our member organizations on various themes and topics to help us identify what the priorities should be and what are the needs of the SaskCulture members. And of course, one of the survey questions was with regards to the top issues. And the ones that were identified as both sustainability was number 1, truth and reconciliation was 4, access to funding, First Nations and Métis participation, and newcomer participation. And one thing as far as how we've interpreted these results and with further consultation, we really believe that these aren't individual silos, but that there's a lot of interplay between them. So we've tried to take that into account with the changes that we're proposing. Continuing on here. Now we're just going to look at a little bit of data to kind of back up what's there beyond the report, the things we've heard from our members. Now this is especially specific to Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan, there were earlier on, and some of you would have seen this data from if you're part of any of the diversity and inclusion training and strategy work. There's the 2016 census, this is kind of an update from what you saw then. It actually indicates that the growth of the Aboriginal population in Saskatchewan is above what the median population growth projection was. So I think this just really underlines that we as cultural organizations are challenged to respond to this growth by adapting how we operate and by making meaningful change. We know that in many respects we are behind, as are many other sectors within the province. Okay, so in the next few slides here, we're going to go over some more statistical data, but this time this is painting a picture of where SaskCulture currently is. This is the data that we acquire as part of our impact framework reporting, which is a report that's specific to the cultural section of the trust for Saskatchewan Lotteries. This data that we're going to review was acquired by reporting of all the funded groups. So it actually indicates from their previous kind of funding period. So there's a bit of a lag from how it's reported to what you see, but the trends are fairly clear in it. In any case, this information, it's intended to highlight where we are systematically as an ecosystem of cultural organizations. In our work with First Nations and Métis community members and organizations, we've heard a very consistent message that truth must come before reconciliation can occur. So this is us with this data trying to look at what is our current truth, how are we currently functioning. And the first one we're going to look at here is Indigenous employment. So this is data from annual global funding from eligible and emerging cultural organizations and their member-funded groups. Of the ECO funding, that constitutes 53% of all the culture section of the trust, and this funding is about $8.2 million. Between 2012 and 2018, the total full-time positions have risen steadily from 131 in 2012 to 165 total in 2018. Within that same period, the Indigenous full-time positions increased from 8 of 131, so 6.1%, to 19 of 165, 11.5% of the positions in 2018. So the total part-time positions compared to the full-times, which we were looking at there, have overall fluctuated up and down between 68 in 2012 to its highest of 80 in 2016, and then to its lowest at 42 in 2018. The Indigenous part-time employment has remained a fairly steady 5 to 6 positions in that period, representing 8 to 11% of all part-time cultural workers. Contract employment, as the last section here, saw the largest upswing in growth, climbing from 82 contractees, 3 Indigenous, so 3.8% in 2012, to 276 rather, of which are 18 Indigenous, so that represents 6.5%, a doubling, but fairly modest numbers in that case. As a whole, Indigenous employment has risen from 6.1% in 2012 to 8.6% in 2018. So now we're looking here at the indicators for Indigenous volunteerism, non-board or committee, through the AGF funding and member funding. Over time, there are some statistical peaks and valleys, gone up and down a little bit, but the trend is that First Nations and Métis volunteerism sits fairly consistently between 0.2 and 1.3% on average. 2018 was a unique year, representing the highest growth of 5.1% from the previous year. However, this jump in volunteerism is directly traceable to a specific special initiatives of an individual ECO in 2018. Overall, total volunteerism across the board has been steady, with some years in decline and some years in growth. However, overall, without Indigenous growth in this area, total volunteerism would be in decline. So we do recognize that this specific statistic is hard to nail down for certainty, as it does require self-declaration from participants to track. So it's likely that there are undeclared Indigenous volunteers engaged in the network that are not populating on this graphic. However, based on what's here, we can assume that it's not a huge percentage in any case. Next here, we're speaking to the Indigenous engagement on volunteer boards and committees. This is a much more reliable statistic than general volunteers overall, as they're kind of more fixed groups. So these stats have also increased annually, with the exception of this past year. 2018 was the first year of decline from 75 board and committee members in 2017 to 64 in 2018. But overall, much stronger, more positive trend. And now, this slide speaks to programs offered by the members of ECO organizations that have specific First Nations or Métis focus. The biggest jump that the programming took place in 2014, rising from 2 to 5%, with incremental climbing after that. And this slide speaks to the ECO programs that require registrations. It does not include activity of ECO member organizations. These numbers have fluctuated up and down between 2012 and 2018. 2018 represents the highest level of engagement, and the total programs in 2018 now sits at 24.9%. And there's a notable spike in activity from some special initiatives, once again, that we mentioned earlier, that took place at the time. The previous year was sitting at 13%. And this next slide speaks to the ECO programs that are open to the public. It does not include the activity of ECO member organizations. And once again, the trend in this is consistent with the previous one, where the numbers go up and down a little bit, but showing growth. And now we are on to the combined total statistic for the overall total number of programs offered through AGF funding that have a First Nations or Métis focus. There is growth, so that's definitely reassuring, but it's also significantly behind in terms of the population and the trends of population growth that we mentioned earlier. So it's really not at pace with how that population is changing. SaskCulture, we've got a suite of programs that have changed over the past decade to make efforts to bridge some of those gaps in engagement. It has grown steadily over the years, along with its volunteer base of adjudicators that contribute to moving these funds forward. And here now are the project funds that are allocated by the Saskatchewan Arts Board. And want to be clear, in this case, this does not speak to SAB's programs overall, just the specific ones that SaskCulture is a funding partner for. So this slide here pulls everything together to summarize the trends that we're seeing in the data. You'll see the average level of full-time employment is higher, and this area was 13% to 14% between 2013 and 2017. Overall, that trend is growth, which is a really positive message to hear, because this is something that we're seeing in the whole cultural community of which SaskCulture is a part. To kind of roll things back from just all the data, we do know, of course, that the numbers and statistics only tell a part of the story. There's nothing that we're showing here that speaks to the relationships that people and organizations have been building over time, the work that has been done, or the experience and the knowledge that has been gained. And we know, certainly from anecdotal evidence, that there has been a ton of growth in this area. However, we can still agree definitely that First Nations and Métis peoples are underrepresented in all the areas of the cultural sector. While acknowledging that we have made gains as a community, we're also aware that there is actually a level of urgency in the TRC report to respond to these calls, and specifically in SaskCulture's context, to acknowledge that many of these calls land squarely on matters pertaining to culture. So we dumped a ton of data on you and a lot of things that go there, and I see we've got questions, and we can read them. So this is specific to an earlier section here. The question is, how will the communities of interests, and of course, how will the community of interest organizations be accommodated is the question. Via a governance policy, for instance? And yes, as far as what was there in the question, this is represented in governance policies. SaskCulture continues to have organizations that serve in the community of interest capacity, and they will continue to help us forward with the needs on that front. Is there anything to say on that front? Anything else?
Oh, there's one more. There's another question here.
Go ahead.
So, why is the term constitution used when this document is simply a set of bylaws? It's always been named a constitution, and principles and values aren't synonyms to perhaps clarifying which are principles and which are values. Principles are the lead statements, which are the upper corner of the slides, and the values begin with SaskCulture values.
Is there another question there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've directed both of those, so I think it's what you have here.
Oh, okay. So we have a longer question here. I was just wondering if we were intending if some of the questions were similar to group them in. So we'll just read this out. So in the third and fourth sections, why is it restricted to cultural activity rather than a broader understanding of what is encompassed by the term culture? The diversity and inclusion strategy from August 2018 doesn't seem to mention gender and sexual diversity. This does not seem to be present in proposed values. How will gender and sexual diversity be addressed by SaskCulture in relation to inclusion initiatives, grants, and funding and other activities. And we can, of course, step in on this, but there's lots of consultations that occurred with regards to principles and values, and with respect to the Constitution. And so, principles and values are definitely meant to be inclusive. That's what we're striving for, and it's important to note that the principles and values within the Constitution do not direct program delivery. That's done through policies, and those policies are based on the lottery agreement, which specifies, quote, cultural activities. So we have a base foundation that is certainly our Constitution. That's sort of the things that we're addressing through the principles and values. But from the and just like you would have in law, if you have a statute, based on the statute, then come regulations, and within the regulation that can also guide. And so just as we're going to be having our Constitution, and we're addressing certain principles and values, and we're not going holistically, quite specific, but those types of things are addressed, through the policies that basically come forth, both through our strategic plan and informed certainly from a foundational document being the Constitution. But again, one of our main mandate from the broad mandate, of course, is cultural activity, and cultural activity certainly does need to be inclusive, and would not be inclusive if it did not address certain things such as sexuality, gender identity, race, class, all those different types of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we're seeing here, actually, although it has potential for huge impact, it's an iterative change, and one that helps provide some specific focus based on a specific impetus. What we have left as it is in the Constitution, as well as some of our other policy documents, like our ends, like our cultural policy, and everything, all of those things come together, and they speak very broadly to access and inclusion, with a lot of what that actually means for how cultural activity is funded, supported, and delivered in the province. So I think that's definitely an area that we want to continue to give attention to and be aware of. But this is as far as with regards to especially what I went on for a very long time about the TRC calls to action, because it is a very specific impetus in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, broader document, a lot of stuff is addressed in policy and in program for sure. So.
Mm-hmm.
And just in terms of like legislative drafting, constitutional drafting in specific, you're required to, I shouldn't say you're required, it's useful to use broad and inclusive type language, because if you use specific language, then we would probably be doing consultations, on a very regular basis, because the idea of what is diverse and what is inclusive is always, quite evolving. But if you basically have a strategy in saying, we have, a principle that, a value or a principle that, this is what we want to do. We will and we are going to be inclusive and diverse. Well, then that means that you are going to be inclusive and diverse, even whatever type of iteration that inclusivity and diversity, may take, whether it be stagnant right now or going into the future.
Mm-hmm. What I would say lastly is that part of this process with what we're engaging with now is to hear that kind of feedback and those kinds of questions. So if you're looking further at the document as a whole, in addition to these specific changes we're making, and you see a gap, that's something that SaskCulture's board definitely wants to hear about. So definitely continue to provide feedback after you've heard our response and taken a further look at the document.
Right, and that's the point of the consultation. So
yeah. And great questions. Thank you so much. And if there's keep them coming. But I think in the meantime, we'll continue on James Rose.
No further questions right now, so we'll just go on to the principles and values, talking about those, and the I guess not so much the cleanup, but more of the substantive proposals that has come up through feedback, both from our membership, it's come up, through the board, and then also through lots of discussions through the Constitution Committee. So like many organizations, we have struggled to determine where to begin or where to situate SaskCulture in relation to this work. As an organization, inclusive of our board and our staff, we acknowledge and affirm that the TRC has opened a window of opportunity which organizations like SaskCulture can access to make gains in these areas. In doing so, and after many discussions and long meetings, it has become clear to us that we need to revisit our own identity as a cultural organization in order to make meaningful progress towards these outcomes. Now, we acknowledge that reconciliation cannot only be an isolated short-term special initiative, a grant program, or a single item on a 3-year strategic plan. The situations with respect to Indigenous peoples can occur overnight, and we're not going to get to truth and reconciliation on a short-term basis. So what is being called for is systematic change to assist in repairing the damaged relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. The calls to action are an appeal to mobilize all levels of government, organizations, as well as individuals to make concrete changes in society. For SaskCulture, we have determined that these principles are significant and ought to be enshrined in SaskCulture's foundational document, SaskCulture's Constitution, Principles and Values. The principles and values identify what the organization stands for. They're foundational and key to its success. Every aspect of the organization outputs are based upon the principles. Volunteers and staff, as well as the membership, have a responsibility to understand these values and principles and to determine and to demonstrate them in their day-to-day action and interactions on behalf of the organization. So values are fundamental beliefs. The strength of the organization are built on these core values. They are the essence of the organization. Principles are guides to behaviors. They guide how an organization lives the values. In everything the organization does, the principles are applied with balance. So these values have been significant to the work of SaskCulture and have been since its incorporation for 20 years ago. Just note some of the words in the original version of the principles and values: accessibility, inclusiveness, equality, and democratic processes, and respect the diversity of the people of Saskatchewan. Multiculturalism within the context of the current provincial and federal legislation. Now, given where we are as an organization, province and country are today, I would say that SaskCulture got it right in its constitution all those years ago. Those values have driven the organization's work and are very significant in its progress over the past 20 years. And the last several years, SaskCulture has placed more effort on its diversity and inclusivity strategy, particularly as it pertains to the Truth and Reconciliation Report. The SaskCulture Constitution does not include the principles of reconciliation word for word. Some are simplified to speak to existing SaskCulture principles, and some are merged to speak more specifically to specific areas of SaskCulture. This one is grouped under the heading SaskCulture Supports Engagement in the Cultural Experience. In 2014, the only statement in this section indicated that SaskCulture will value the diversity of the cultural community and its ability to provide a wide range of cultural experiences. And all of these examples, the SaskCulture will value has been changed to SaskCulture value. This wording has changed to become more direct and not stated to be somehow in the future tense. The only value that has been in this heading has been a consistent, long-standing value of SaskCulture, and we're not changing it. We're adding to it. As SaskCulture has progressed in its diversity and inclusion strategy, it is evident that specific values around Indigenous cultural revitalization need articulation, as does the emphasis on sustained cultural exchange. As noted previously, we are proposing that under the second value, we add bullet 3, multiculturalism as a means to promote the understanding and creativity that arises from the interaction between and the involving expressions of different cultures. So this statement is taken from the Canadian Multiculturalism Act. This bullet replaces the reference and the current constitution to the Government Acts of Canada and Saskatchewan. Previously, there was a reference to both acts, which would imply that SaskCulture is in agreement with everything in both acts. Now, these acts have not been updated in quite a number of years, and there's some perspective on Indigenous peoples in terms of multiculturalism that SaskCulture is not in agreement with. We believe that if either government were to revise these policies today, based on what we have learned as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation report, these policies would change. The increased number of newcomers to Saskatchewan over the past 10 years is an important part of Saskatchewan's work in terms of its inclusion and diversity strategy, and the renewed principles and values speak to SaskCulture's intent. So these two statements are in addition to the principles and values section. SaskCulture will be responsive to the Saskatchewan people. In SaskCulture's work and engagement with Indigenous communities, elders, partner organizations, we've heard this message repeatedly. In the process of reconciliation, we must acknowledge that reconciliation cannot be another attempt at assimilation. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples, language, culture, art forms, expression, and way of life are inherent to this land we call Saskatchewan. So, SaskCulture values that Indigenous peoples, as self-determining peoples, have their own knowledge system, oral histories, laws, protocols, and connections to the land, which, taken together, are necessary to the reconciliation process. This second statement also speaks to taking constructive action on addressing the ongoing legacies of colonialism that have had destructive impacts on Indigenous peoples' cultures and languages as part of reconciliation. We know the history of Canada's colonial Indian Act policies that sought to kill the Indian and the child through disenfranchisement of the land, language, culture, and identity through residential schools and subsequent 60s scoop, resulting in social and cultural condition that persists to this day. SaskCulture acknowledges that as a community-driven provincial cultural organization, we must be responsive to these outcomes through constructive action. In the principles and values, SaskCulture recognizes strength and common purpose. The first bullet was revised from, quote, SaskCulture will be an inclusive and cohesive force for cultural community from which the community will draw strength. So the term force was removed as was determined that was a word that had an aggressive undertone. The rephrasing of SaskCulture will be a force for the community to SaskCulture values an inclusive and cohesive cultural community speaks to SaskCulture valuing the cultural community as a whole, from which communities will draw strength. The old statement positions SaskCulture itself as the force from which communities draw strength. The second part of the value also has changed to, quote, from which the community will gather strength. This has been expanded to, quote, from which communities will gather strength, to reinforce the idea that we are working with multiple and diverse communities. In the third bullet, SaskCulture values cooperation and partnership between cultural organizations as well as other sectors. In the original statement, other sectors were defined as public and private sectors. We found that to be too specific and narrow and have expanded this to include a general statement about other sectors. And the fifth bullet connects back to the TRC principles, and we have included the quote, sharing responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships as treaty people, as an addition to SaskCulture's principle of recognizing strength in common purpose. Now, we recognize and acknowledge that we are all treaty people, and we must be mindful and respectful of our relationships with one another. This speaks to the Cree word wakotoing, good relations, kinship, and interconnectedness of communities, including natural environment and systems. In SaskCulture's principle, SaskCulture provides equitable and fair access to resources. The first two bullets of the 2014 have been merged into one concise statement, as they were relatable enough to be condensed into one concise statement. The only addition to this section is the delivery of relevant cultural activity that is based upon cultural impact, accessibility, and service. Now, upon review, we acknowledge that we are clear on our values for transparency, accountability, of funding effectiveness and efficiency of programs and services, but we had no value specific to relevancy, impact, accessibility, and service. These additions are the outputs of the previous statements. We value
No, you're on the right one there. Yeah, sorry.
Now, apologies for that. We value a well-oiled machine that operates and performs that the way it ought to be, but we also want to value the function of that well-oiled machine and its ability to be relevant to the needs of community and able to demonstrate impact, accessibility, and service.
So it's question time, and before that though, I was given a reminder that at some point one of us or all of us have misspoke. It says here that the calls of action are calls to action, not recommendations. And the difference there is, in the one case, it speaks a lot more to agency of individuals and organizations to determine how they go forward with that to meet those needs rather than some specific recommendations. And questions? None at the moment.
Nothing on the stream? Okay. And remember, you can email your questions to Rose afterwards if you think of any. The stream will be closing after this, so you won't be able to use the chat box. But again, any more questions? Or, there's the 2 public consultations coming up shortly as well, if you have any more things to talk about.
Now, I know, just if I may, and please Joanne and James as well, we're really excited about these constitutional proposals, and we're really excited to bring those towards you, the membership, and hear any of your feedback. So as Joanne said, if any questions arise, maybe not this instance, but later on, there's the 2 public consultations that are coming up, or you can email Rose. And once again, SaskCulture's sort of kind of at the forefront. I know the calls to action have been around for a while, but we thought it was not just necessary to put in, not just within the policies or regulations or something, but actually make it core. It's a part of our foundational document, the Constitution, that both sends not just a strong message, but also creates almost a requirement for us as an organization to not just treat the TRC calls to actions as simply recommendations or something, as a side note or a footnote, but actually enshrine it so we can actually get to the point of not just truth, but actually true reconciliation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
Still no questions? Okay. Well, we'll sign off, and thank you again for joining us.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Hold on, there's one here.
Oh.
I just saw it. No, maybe I'm imagining things.
Damon's imagining things.
Okay, so we're going to sign off. Good night, everybody. Thank you.